It wasn't the planet's fault that it tried to kill everyone. It was just doing what it was built to do, be a gigantic death trap. Welcome to Zinth, where every sunrise tries to burn your retinas off and every sunset makes you question why you ever decided to leave the comforts of oxygen-rich Earth. The year was, well, let's not get bogged down in calendars. Let's just say it wasn't yesterday, but it sure as hell felt like it. Jareth stood on the edge of a rocky outcrop, staring into the abyss of the planet's infamous dust sea. Somewhere down, there was a core that didn't play by the normal rules of physics. It was like the universe's worst joke, a time-dilated anomaly that made long-distance communication as reliable as a politician's promise. "Hey, Leora," Jareth shouted over his shoulder, trying to be heard over the screeching wind that was doing its best to blow him off his perch. He didn't really mind. Falling to his death might have been a welcome break from the tedious hell that was colonizing Zinth. Leora, busy wrestling with a piece of equipment that looked suspiciously like it had been designed for a different planet entirely, didn't bother to look up. "What?" she yelled back, her voice sharp enough to cut through the howling wind. "Remind me again why we're doing this," Jareth asked, not for the first time. "Because we enjoy long walks on deadly terrain and making first contact with homicidal planets," Leora replied, giving the equipment a final, triumphant smack. It sputtered to life with a series of beeps that sounded distressingly like laughter. Jareth chuckled, though it was more of a dry wheeze. "Right. I forgot about my masochistic tendencies. The settlement was a collection of hovels that generously called themselves buildings. They'd been cobbled together with whatever materials didn't disintegrate upon contact with Zinth's charming atmosphere. A mix of metal sheets, reinforced polymers, and a prayer to whatever deity might have been listening. That last part was crucial, as Leora often said, since divine intervention seemed like the only logical way they'd survive. "Jareth, if you've got time to complain, you've got time to help," Leora reminded him, gesturing to the tangled mess of wires and panels that was supposed to be their communication array. "We're trying to phone home, remember?" "Yeah, about that," Jareth said, reluctantly dragging his feet over to her side. "Have you considered that maybe Earth doesn't want to hear from us? I mean, we've barely been gone a decade. They might have finally gotten used to the peace and quiet. Or maybe they're just as miserable as we are and want someone else to commiserate with," Leora countered, handing him a tool that looked more like a murder weapon than a wrench. Jareth took it and began tightening bolts with the enthusiasm of a man digging his own grave. "You ever wonder if the planet's listening to us?" Leora snorted. "If it is, I hope it's taking notes. Maybe it'll learn some new ways to torture us. Or maybe it'll just kill us quicker," Jareth mused, making sure to keep an eye on the horizon. There was something about the way the air shimmered in the distance, like someone was waving around a very large, very sharp knife. Truth was, there was more to worry about than just the planet. Rumors, those delightful whispers that spread faster than any plague, suggested that Zinth wasn't as barren as it seemed. Something was out there, lurking in the shadows. Something that had taken a liking to their feeble attempts at survival. Jareth didn't like to think about it, mostly because thinking too hard about the potential for his brain to be used as an intergalactic chew toy gave him a headache. Leora wiped her brow and gave him a look. "We need to get this sorted soon. The anomaly's causing enough lag that our messages to Earth sound like they've been translated from 12 different languages. Maybe they'll think it's art," Jareth said, still wrestling with the bolts. "Or maybe they'll think we're dead and send a rescue party." "Imagine their surprise when they find us still alive, only slightly deranged," Leora shot back. Jareth paused, looking at her with a smirk. Slightly, Leora matched his gaze with her own brand of deadpan humor. "Okay, more than slightly. But sanity's overrated anyway." The sun, or whatever Zinth called its local star, was beginning to set, painting the landscape in a harsh red glow that made everything look like it was on fire. Fitting, since Jareth always felt like he was living in a perpetual barbecue. The kind where he was the main course. As they worked, a low hum began to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. At first, Jareth thought it was the equipment finally throwing in the towel, but then he realized it was the planet itself, rumbling in a way that suggested it was either very upset or very hungry. "Leora," he said slowly, eyes scanning the horizon again. "You hear that yet?" she replied, her voice tense. "And I'd bet my last cup of real coffee it's not a good sign," Jareth sighed. "Why does everything on this rock want to kill us?" "Because we're trespassing, and humans are notoriously bad at respecting keep-out signs," Leora said, not missing a beat. They both stopped working, the tension in the air thicker than the layer of dust coating everything. Jareth could feel the planet watching them, its presence more tangible than ever. It was like being under the gaze of a particularly sadistic school principal. "Think it'll let us off with a warning?" Jareth quipped, trying to lighten the mood. Leora shook her head. "I doubt it. More likely it's plotting our demise in the most creative way possible." The hum grew louder, a symphony of dread that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of their racing hearts. Jareth and Leora exchanged a glance, the kind that didn't need words. They both knew what was coming, or at least they thought they did. Then, as if someone had flipped a cosmic switch, the noise stopped. Silence descended like a heavy, uncomfortable blanket, and Jareth found himself holding his breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Maybe we should head back inside," Leora suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Jareth agreed, though he didn't move. He was rooted to the spot, struck by the eerie calm, and that's when he felt it. A presence brushing against his mind like a cold breeze. Not the kind that makes you reach for a sweater, but the kind that makes you question your sanity. It was alien, unfamiliar, and unsettling. "Jareth?" Leora's voice jolted him back to reality. Yeah. Let's go," he said, finally managing to tear his gaze away from the horizon. They hurried back to the settlement, the makeshift structures offering a semblance of safety. But as the door slid shut behind them, Jareth couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them inside. He glanced at Leora, who was busy securing the locks. "You feel that?" "Feel what?" she asked, though her eyes told him she already knew. "That sense of impending doom," Jareth said, trying to sound casual and failing miserably. "Every damn day," Leora replied, forcing a smile. "But this time it feels a bit more personal." Jareth laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Great. Just what we needed, a sentient planet with a vendetta." They both stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. It was almost comforting, like the lull before a storm. But Jareth knew better than to trust such moments. On Zinth, peace was just the world's way of lulling you into a false sense of security before it tried to eat you alive again. "Think Earth's getting our messages?" Leora asked, breaking the silence. "Probably not," Jareth admitted. "But at least we're trying. That's got to count for something, right?" "Sure," Leora said, though they both knew trying didn't mean much when you were up against impossible odds. Jareth leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes. Maybe he'd get lucky and dream of something other than his imminent demise. But as his mind drifted, he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. It wasn't paranoia if the planet really was out to get you. Leora's voice cut through his thoughts. "Hey Jareth, yeah, next time we get a chance to colonize a planet, let's pick one that doesn't hate us." Jareth chuckled, the sound echoing softly in the dim room. "Deal. But knowing our luck, we'd end up on a paradise planet that's infested with killer bunnies." Leora smirked. "At least they'd be cute." They both shared a quiet laugh, the sound a small defiance against the uncertainty surrounding them. But even as they tried to find humor in their predicament, the lingering sense of unease remained. Zinth was watching, waiting, and somehow, Jareth knew this was just the beginning of a very long, very dangerous game. The next morning, as Jareth stepped outside to face another day of survival, he couldn't help but wonder if they'd ever truly be free from the planet's grasp. But that was a problem for future Jareth, who, he hoped, would be a lot luckier than present Jareth. As for now, all he could do was keep moving forward and hope that, when the time came, he'd be ready to face whatever Zinth had in store. Jareth woke up to the charming screech of Zinth's murderous dawn. The planet's sunrise wasn't just a visual treat. It was a full sensory assault, like sticking your head in a hornet's nest while a death metal band rehearsed next door. He groaned, rolling off the cot that had all the comfort of a bed of nails, and stumbled outside. Leora was already there, fiddling with the communication array. She had that look on her face, part determination, part homicidal intent toward uncooperative technology. "Morning, sunshine," she called out, not looking up. "Is it?" Jareth grumbled, rubbing sleep out of his eyes. "I thought it was just an extension of last night's hell." "Same difference," Leora replied, giving the equipment a swift kick. It sputtered in protest, then settled back into its usual state of disappointing inadequacy. "This thing refuses to let us call home." "Maybe it's for the best," Jareth said. "If life on Earth wasn't already bad, hearing from us might push them over the edge." Leora laughed, a sharp, dry sound. "Right. We'd probably give them all existential crises." As Jareth joined her, there was a strange sensation at the edge of his consciousness. An itch he couldn't quite scratch. It was like a whisper, barely audible but insistent. He wondered if it was just another delightful quirk of Zinth, but then he noticed Leora's face. She looked like she was trying to remember if she'd left the stove on at home, in another solar system. "You feel that?" he asked, hoping he wasn't going mad alone. "Yeah," Leora said slowly. "It's like someone's trying to crawl inside my head without an invitation." "Charming," Jareth muttered. "Nothing like a little unsolicited telepathy with your morning coffee." The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like ants marching across his brain. Jareth clutched his head, trying to focus through the disorienting sensation. It was like listening to a radio that couldn't quite tune into the right frequency. "Think it's the planet?" Leora asked through gritted teeth. "Doubt it," Jareth said. "Feels more alive, like it's got a personality." Leora snorted. "Great, just what we need, another thing with a grudge." The sensation shifted, becoming more chaotic. Images flashed through Jareth's mind, too fast to catch but too vivid to ignore. Bits and pieces of memories, fears, hopes. The kind of stuff you'd pay a shrink to dive into, not some intergalactic busybody. "Leora," he said, trying to stay calm. "We might have company. More colonists?" she asked, sounding both hopeful and skeptical. "Not unless colonists have started mind melding," Jareth replied. "Feels more like alien telepaths with a bad sense of boundaries." The thought sent a chill down his spine. Telepaths were one of those things you read about in sci-fi novels or files marked top secret, not something you expected to encounter on a homicidal rock like Zinth. "Can they understand us?" Leora wondered, her voice tinged with both curiosity and fear. "God, I hope not," Jareth said. "The last thing I need is some alien therapist critiquing my mental state." Leora chuckled despite their predicament. "Wonder what they'll make of us." "Probably think we're all insane," Jareth said with a grin. "Which is fair, considering we chose to live here." The presence in his mind wavered, as if caught off guard by the sheer chaos of human thought. Jareth imagined it like a librarian walking into a rave, expecting silence and order but finding only noise and madness. "Hey, maybe we're too much for them," Leora said, a wicked glint in her eye. "Maybe human brains are like the ultimate horror show." "Wouldn't that be something?" Jareth replied. "Aliens come to probe our minds and run screaming." The idea was absurd, but it offered a twisted kind of hope. If human thoughts were too erratic, too unpredictable, then maybe they had a chance. As if responding to his thoughts, the presence seemed to recoil. Jareth could almost picture it staggering back, overwhelmed by the mental mess it had stumbled into. "Think we're giving them a headache?" Leora asked. "Hope so," Jareth said. "Be nice to be the cause of someone else's misery for a change." The sensation began to fade, the whispers retreating like a tide going out. Jareth let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, relief washing over him. But Leora's expression remained tense. "What if they come back?" she asked, voicing the worry that had nestled in the back of his mind. "Then we give them another dose of human chaos," Jareth said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Let them see what real nightmares look like. "Think that'll work?" Leora asked, raising an eyebrow. Jareth shrugged. "Worth a shot. And if not, well, at least we can say we tried." As the presence finally faded completely, leaving only the usual oppressive atmosphere of Zinth, Jareth found himself oddly hopeful. If human minds were enough to drive off telepathic aliens, then maybe they weren't as helpless as they'd thought. "Come on," he said to Leora, nudging her with his elbow. "Let's get back to work. Maybe we'll finally get that message through to Earth." "Yeah," Leora agreed, picking up her tools. "And if not, we can always use the equipment as a really expensive paperweight." Together, they returned to the task at hand, their banter a shield against the uncertainty and danger that lurked just beyond the horizon. Whatever the day brought, they would face it with the same grim determination and dark humor that had gotten them this far. And as they worked, Jareth couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just won a small victory in a much larger war. One they didn't even understand yet. But for now, it was enough to know that they weren't alone in their struggle, and that their minds were a force to be reckoned with, even in the vastness of space. Jareth woke to the sound of an explosion. Not the kind of gentle, soothing explosion you'd hear in a lullaby, but the type that rattles your very bones and leaves a taste of singed ozone in your mouth. His immediate thought was that Zinth had finally decided to finish them off in its grand vendetta against human colonists. He rolled off his cot, an experience akin to peeling oneself from a Velcro wall, and staggered outside. The sky was a masterpiece of chaos, with vibrant streaks of fire painting the horizon. But this wasn't Zinth's usual attempt at cosmic art. This was an attack. Leora was already outside, crouched over the communication array, which was now smoking ominously. "Morning, sunshine," Jareth croaked, voice hoarse from the dust and smoke. "Seems the neighbors aren't too fond of us," Leora replied, not bothering to look up. Her hands were a blur of movement as she attempted to salvage the charred remains of the equipment. "Vixari?" Jareth asked, though he was fairly sure of the answer. Only they had the flair for the dramatic necessary to set the sky on fire. "Who else?" Leora said with a shrug. "I guess they got tired of the silent treatment and decided to drop by with fireworks." "Charming," Jareth muttered, eyeing the path of destruction. The Vixari were known for two things: their telepathic ability to probe minds like overly curious librarians, and their penchant for erratic violence. It seemed they'd opted for both today. "Any bright ideas?" Leora asked, finally tearing her gaze away from the ruins of their would-be lifeline to Earth. "Not yet," Jareth admitted, "but give me a minute. I'm sure inspiration will strike, probably in the form of a meteor." As they surveyed the damage, Jareth's mind churned, trying to wrap itself around the problem. The Vixari attacks were becoming more frequent, more unpredictable, and frankly, more annoying. It was like being perpetually nagged by an invisible mother-in-law with anger management issues. "Think it's possible to use the planet against them?" Jareth mused aloud, eyeing the distant dust sea with a speculative gleam. "The dust sea?" Leora asked, catching his line of sight. "The place where physics goes to die." "Exactly," Jareth said. "If we can lure them there, maybe we can use the time dilation anomalies to our advantage." Leora looked skeptical, but there was a glimmer of interest in her eyes. "You're suggesting we exploit the insanity of Zinth itself? Why not?" Jareth replied with a wry grin. "It's been trying to kill us since we got here. About time we put it to work." The idea was wild, reckless, and had a high chance of backfiring spectacularly. In other words, it was exactly the kind of plan that might just work on Zinth. "All right," Leora said, her voice firm. "Let's see how we can turn this hell into a weapon." The first step was to draw the Vixari into the dust sea. Easier said than done, considering the aliens seemed to prefer ambush tactics to frontal assaults. But desperation breeds creativity, or madness, and Jareth was counting on both. They spent the next few hours rigging up a series of makeshift transmitters, scavenged from the remains of their equipment. The idea was simple: create a signal so annoying, so obnoxious, that the Vixari wouldn't be able to resist investigating. Think it'll work? Leora asked as they set up the final transmitter. If it doesn't, at least we'll have annoyed them, Jareth said with a shrug. And at this point, pissing them off is better than doing nothing. With the transmitters in place, they retreated to a safe distance, or what passed for safe on Zinth, and waited. The minutes dragged by, each one stretching an eternity as they hoped, prayed, and cursed under their breath. Then, like a shark responding to blood in the water, the Vixari stirred. "That's it," Leora whispered, peering through a pair of battered binoculars. "They're moving." "Good," Jareth replied, heart racing. "Now let's see if we can lead them into the trap." It was a tense, nerve-wracking game of cat and mouse, with Jareth and Leora playing the roles of both bait and hunter. They darted through the rocky terrain, leading the Vixari toward the Dust Sea with a combination of clever misdirection and sheer reckless audacity. As they neared the Dust Sea, the world seemed to shift around them, the very air humming with the planet's peculiar energy. It was like stepping into a dream or a nightmare, where nothing was quite as it seemed. "This is it," Jareth said, his voice barely audible over the thrum of the anomalies. "We need to get them right into the heart of it." "Easy for you to say," Leora muttered, her expression grim. "I feel like we're in the belly of the beast." "Exactly where we need to be," Jareth replied, his eyes fixed on the swirling landscape ahead. The Vixari were close now, their presence a tangible weight in Jareth's mind. He could feel their confusion, their anger, like a pressure building behind his eyes. "Almost there," he said, urging them forward even as his pulse pounded in his ears. They reached the center of the Dust Sea, where the anomalies were strongest, and Jareth risked a glance back. The Vixari were right on their tails, unwittingly charging into the trap. "Now!" he shouted, and Leora hit the switch on the final transmitter, sending out a pulse of energy that resonated through the anomalies. The effect was immediate and chaotic. The air shimmered, bending and twisting as the fabric of reality itself seemed to rebel. The Vixari were caught in the maelstrom, their forms distorting as time and space folded in on themselves. "Did it work?" Leora asked, her voice edged with the kind of manic hope only the truly desperate possess. Jareth watched as the Vixari struggled, their cohesion unraveling in the grip of Zinth's bizarre physics. They writhed, caught in a loop of time that turned their own aggression against them. "I think it did," Jareth said, a grin spreading across his face. "We actually did it." The Vixari, for all their telepathic prowess and technological superiority, were helpless against the chaotic might of Zinth. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless, a testament to human stubbornness and creativity in the face of overwhelming odds. As the dust began to settle, Jareth and Leora exchanged a look, a shared recognition of the insanity that had brought them to this point. They'd turned the very thing that threatened to destroy them into a weapon, and in doing so, they'd bought themselves a little more time. "Guess we're not so helpless after all," Leora said, her voice laced with dark satisfaction. "Seems not," Jareth replied, a sense of cautious optimism creeping into his tone. "But let's not get cocky. We're still stuck on a planet that hates us with a burning passion." "True," Leora agreed, a wry smile playing on her lips. "But at least we gave the Vixari something to think about." As they made their way back to the relative safety of their camp, Jareth couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They'd managed to outsmart their enemies, if only temporarily, and that was no small feat. "Think we'll get off this rock anytime soon?" Leora asked, her tone a mix of sarcasm and genuine curiosity. "Maybe," Jareth said. "Or maybe we'll just keep surviving one day at a time, until the universe decides it's had enough of us." "Sounds about right," Leora replied with a laugh. "But hey, at least we made it through another day. And for now, that was enough." The Vixari were still out there, still a threat, but Jareth knew they'd face whatever came next with the same grim determination and dark humor that had brought them this far. As the sun set, casting the landscape in hues of ominous red and gold, Jareth and Leora sat together, silent but content in the knowledge that they weren't just surviving, they were fighting back. And in the grimdark expanses of space, That was a victory worth savoring. Jareth and Leora were back at camp, taking stock of their situation. The place smelled like a barbecue gone wrong, with a hint of melted circuits. The heartwarming scent of survival on Zinth. "Well, we certainly gave the Vixari something to chew on," Leora said, poking at a piece of fried equipment with a stick. "But I reckon they are not the forgiving type." "No," Jareth agreed, rubbing a hand over his face. "They're more the hold a grudge for eternity and then some type. I half expect them to show up with a bottle of wine and a grudge to last a millennium. To think Earth said colonizing Zinth would be an adventure," Leora muttered, shaking her head. "They didn't specify it would involve playing tag with homicidal aliens." Details, Jareth said with a dismissive wave. "At least your mom can't nag you about being a couch potato anymore," Leora snorted. "Right. Now she just worries about brain-melting aliens instead." "Upgrade," Jareth chuckled, but the amusement didn't quite reach his eyes. They both knew their current victory was a temporary reprieve. The Vixari would regroup, reconsider, and resume their relentless assault eventually. As if reading his mind, Leora said, "We need more than temporary victories. We need something that'll make the Vixari back off for good, or at least long enough for us to figure out an exit strategy." Jareth nodded, eyes scanning the debris. "Otherwise, we're just rearranging deck chairs while the ship sinks." Leora crouched back down by the remains of the communication array, tinkering with the guts of the machine. "Communications are still down, but I might have found something interesting buried in here." Jareth raised an eyebrow. "Interesting as in might help us survive or might blow us up." "Hopefully the first option," Leora replied, her fingers deftly extracting a small, silver device from the wreckage. "I think the Vixari might have a flaw in their telepathic network. Something we might exploit." Jareth leaned closer, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "How so?" "Well," Leora began, brushing dust off the device, "it looks like their telepathic signals are processed through a centralized network. If we can disrupt that, we might throw their communication into chaos." Jareth whistled softly. "So, you're saying we could make a bunch of telepathic aliens unable to coordinate? Like cutting the strings of an unfortunate puppet show." "Precisely," Leora said, "but there's a catch." "Because of course there is," Jareth said, folding his arms. "What's the catch?" "The disruption could potentially have catastrophic consequences for the planet itself," Leora admitted, her tone sobering. "Zinth's already a mess of conflicting physics. Messing with telepathic signals might amplify the anomalies. So basically, we might turn Zinth into an even bigger hellscape," Jareth asked, though he already knew the answer. "Possibly," Leora said, her expression grim. Jareth sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Well, aren't we just the gift that keeps on giving? It's like we found a way to make an already crappy situation crappier." "Hooray us. We need to decide if it's worth the risk," Leora said, looking him in the eye. "Do we gamble with the planet to buy us more time, or do we wait and hope the Vixari get bored?" "Waiting's never been my strong suit," Jareth confessed. "But I'm not keen on playing planetary roulette either." They both fell silent, the weight of the choice pressing down on them. Exploiting the weakness could grant them a significant tactical advantage, but at what cost? The planet was unpredictable enough without them adding fuel to the fire. "Think about it," Leora said, finally breaking the silence. "If we pull this off, we might not just buy ourselves time. We could possibly force the Vixari to retreat." "And if it goes wrong?" Jareth asked, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "We could be the first colonists to accidentally implode a planet." "Think of it as contributing to scientific discovery," Leora said, her lips twitching into a wry smile. "The art of planetary destruction." "You always know how to sell a plan, Leora," Jareth said with a chuckle. "But seriously, can we even trust that this little gizmo can do what you think it can?" "Trust is a strong word," Leora replied. "I'm betting on a hunch and a hope. But what else have we got?" Jareth sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of their predicament. "Reckon we should put it to a vote." "Yeah," Leora nodded. "Let the others weigh in. No sense in making this decision alone." Their fellow colonists were a motley crew, as one might expect from a group of people desperate or foolish enough to settle on a planet like Zinth. Varied in background but united in their knack for survival, they were the ragtag team nobody would bet on, except maybe as a punchline. Gathering everyone wasn't too difficult. Living in constant fear of annihilation had a way of keeping people close. Once assembled, Jareth laid out their discovery and the possible implications. "We might have a way to mess with the Vixari," he said, gesturing to the gadget Leora had found. "But it means messing with the planet too." There was a collective pause, each colonist processing the gamble being proposed. "So what you're saying," said Greer, the group's resident pessimist, "is we have the choice between frying their telepathic brains or frying ourselves." "Pretty much," Leora confirmed, unflustered by Greer's usual doom-and-gloom demeanor. "And if we don't," asked Kian, ever the pragmatist. "Just wait for them to finish the job they started," Jareth shrugged. "Could be another option, but I reckon waiting for them to kill us isn't productive." "Reckon not," Kian muttered. "What do we even know about this planet's core?" asked Cass, the self-appointed historian with a fondness for asking questions that almost always led to more questions. "Not a lot," Leora admitted, "except it doesn't follow normal physics. Everything here is unpredictable at best." "Except the Vixari," Greer chimed in, ever the ray of sunshine. "They're predictably violent." Silence fell again, the weight of the decision like a tangible presence in the cramped room. "Show of hands, then," Jareth suggested, a note of resignation in his voice. Hands went up hesitantly, some quicker than others. They were a cautious group, but desperation had a way of tipping the scales. The majority was clear they'd take the risk. "All right," Jareth said, nodding. "We do this carefully, no room for screw-ups." "Agreed," Leora said, her tone a mix of determination and wariness. "Let's make sure this doesn't end with us blown to bits." "That's the spirit," Jareth said with a sardonic smile. "Let's not die messily." The decision made, they set about preparing. It was a sobering task, tampering with forces they barely understood, hoping their gamble would pay off rather than spiral into chaos. As the group worked, the air hung thick with the tension of their choice. They were a team forged in adversity, bound by their shared struggle to survive on a planet that seemed to loathe them with every alien gust of wind. "Do you ever wonder," Leora asked as they worked side by side, "what it would have been like if we'd colonized somewhere else?" "All the time," Jareth replied. "But then I remember how good I look covered in sweat and dust, and it all feels worth it." Leora laughed, the sound bright yet laced with the same weary edge that had become part of their existence. "At least we won't die pretty." "There's a silver lining," Jareth agreed, grinning. As they moved through the final stages of preparation, Jareth felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. It wasn't confidence exactly, more of a resigned acceptance. They were doing something reckless, sure, but they were doing something. In the grimdark calculus of their lives, action, however desperate, was always preferable to inaction. "Ready?" Leora asked, her eyes meeting his. "Ready as I'll ever be," Jareth replied, throwing the switch. The device hummed to life, a low, thrumming sound that resonated through the room. It was a small thing, unassuming, and yet it held the potential to reshape their fate for better or worse. The room was silent save for the device's steady pulse. It was, Jareth reflected, like listening to the heartbeat of a dangerous idea. Leora's voice broke the quiet, a wry edge to her words. "Here's to not dying in a spectacular implosion. And maybe screwing over the Vixari while we're at it," Jareth added. The device pulsed, sending waves of energy through the air. The effect was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, like the faintest tremor before an earthquake. Then slowly the tremor grew, the planet itself reacting to the disturbance as if Zinth resented their meddling, the ground beneath them seeming to groan in protest. "Hold on," Leora warned, bracing against the table. It wasn't the first time the planet had thrown a tantrum beneath their feet. "Never a dull moment," Jareth muttered, gripping the edge of the makeshift desk. As the device continued its work, a rising sense of unease crept through the gathered colonists. They were playing with fire, and everyone knew it. "You think it's working?" Kian asked, his voice carrying a note of reluctant hope. "Either it's working, or we've just pissed off the biggest hornet's nest in the universe," Greer replied, ever the optimist. "Nothing ventured, nothing gained," Jareth said, though his eyes were fixed on the flickering lights of the device. If they were going to survive this, a little reckless optimism couldn't hurt, right? The minutes stretched, each one heavier than the last, as they waited for some sign that their daring gamble had paid off. And then, gradually, the tension in the air lessened, the ground settling into a cautious stillness. It was like the planet itself had paused, holding its breath to see what would happen next. "Did we do it?" Cass asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Looks like it," Leora said, a cautious smile playing on her lips. "But let's not celebrate just yet." Jareth nodded, aware of the fragile equilibrium they'd found. They'd taken a risk, and for now it seemed to have paid off. But consequences had a way of catching up when least expected. "Guess we wait and see," Jareth said, his voice carrying a mix of relief and lingering tension. "Here's to hoping the Vaiksari decide Zinth isn't worth the hassle," Leora said, crossing her fingers. "And if they don't?" Greer asked, his tone sour as ever. "Then," Jareth replied, "we'll just have to come up with another insane plan." With that, the colonists settled into their uneasy truce with the planet, each one knowing the fight was far from over, but strengthened by the knowledge they'd managed to turn the tables, however briefly. For now, they had a chance, however slim, and in the grimdark reaches of space, even a chance was something worth holding onto. The thing about Zinth is that it's always itching for a fight, like that scrappy street dog nobody bothers with until it bites you in the backside. And right now, with the Vaiksari cranked up to a full-scale assault, it felt like the planet had been saving up its bite for just this occasion. Jareth staggered through the dust-choked air, feeling every step in his bones like the planet was personally trying to shake him off. Leora was beside him, her expression a blend of determination and mild irritation, the kind you get when the universe insists on kicking you when you're already down. Could this get any worse? Jareth shouted over the din as a Vaiksari drone whizzed overhead, its shrill screech a reminder that things could always get worse. "Now there's a challenge," Leora replied, ducking as a piece of debris sailed past her head. "Next, you'll be asking if it can rain acid or something. Let's not give Zinth any ideas," Jareth said, ducking beside her behind a battered piece of machinery they'd once foolishly thought would terraform the place into a haven. "Yeah, right. They might as well have tried knitting a sweater for a black hole." The colonists were scattered around the camp, everyone in various states of panic and grim resignation. Greer was barking orders, his voice sharp as a razor and twice as unpleasant. "Get those barriers up. Move it. We're not just going to sit here and let them pick us off." A motivational speaker in another life, I'm sure, Leora quipped, as the two of them emerged from their temporary cover and made for the comm array. It sputtered and spat like an old man cursing at the sky, a testament to their chances of getting a distress signal out to anywhere remotely useful. "You think it's still functional?" Jareth asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "About as functional as a paper umbrella in a meteor shower," Leora said, squinting at the array like she could will it into working. "But we've got to try." He nodded because what else was there to do? The Vaiksari were battering their perimeter, sending wave after wave like it was some kind of cosmic game of whack-a-mole, and they were all out of mallets. It was times like these that made you ponder life's little pleasures, like oxygen and a lack of screaming aliens. As Leora fiddled with the controls, Jareth scanned the horizon. The sky was a mess of colors, the kind of sunset you'd get if the sun was having a migraine. Somewhere out there, past the dust and chaos, the Vaiksari were plotting, scheming, and generally being a pain in the ass. "Connections shot to hell," Leora muttered, tapping the console with a fist. "We're not getting a signal out." "Figures," Jareth sighed. "Guess it's up to us then." "Always is," Leora said, flashing him a smile that was all bravado and no certainty. "You know, if we survive this, I'm buying a planet without homicidal neighbors. Make sure it's got a nice view," Jareth replied as they returned to the main group. "Or at least one where the sunsets aren't trying to kill us." The colonists were hunkered down, a mix of makeshift barricades and raw nerve holding them together. Kian was doing the rounds, checking on people, offering a word here, a nod there. The kind of leadership that comes from being the second least terrified person in the room. Jareth and Leora joined him, scanning the horizon for the next wave. The Vixari had gone quiet, which was never a good sign. It meant they were planning their next move, or maybe just toying with them. Aliens had a sick sense of humor that way. "You think they're regrouping?" Kian asked, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve. "Wouldn't surprise me," Leora said, her voice carrying that same worn edge that seemed to grip everyone these days. "They like to keep us on our toes." "Well, my toes are about ready to give up and send the rest of me a resignation letter," Jareth grumbled, his eyes still scanning the horizon. "How's everyone holding up?" "Still breathing," Kian said, which was about the best news anyone could hope for. "But we're running low on everything." "Shocking," Leora said, rolling her eyes. "I thought we were living the high life out here." They shared a grim chuckle, the kind born from shared misery and the dark humor that kept them all from losing it entirely. "Maybe, if we can hold out a little longer, the Vixari will give up and go home," Jareth suggested, though even he didn't believe it. "Or they'll just decide to level the whole planet," Greer countered, joining them with a look that said he'd seen it all and wasn't impressed. "Always the optimist," Leora sighed. "You know me," Greer replied, his eyes scanning the distant ridges. "I'm a ray of sunshine." The air was thick with tension, every moment stretched to breaking. They were on the brink, teetering at the edge, but damn if they weren't holding on with everything they had. "All right," Jareth said, taking a breath. "What's our next move?" "We hold," Kian said simply. "We hold and we wait for an opening." Jareth nodded because what else was there to do? They couldn't win this fight outright, but they could make it so costly for the Vixari that maybe, just maybe, they'd decide it wasn't worth it. "Then we hold," Jareth agreed, his voice carrying a conviction he didn't quite feel. The Vixari attack came just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into that brief moment of darkness before the moon's rose. It was a hell of a sight, and a hell of a time for an assault. The aliens descended like a storm, their numbers a terrifying blur against the night sky. Jareth's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline a cold fire in his veins. "Here we go," Leora muttered, her voice a low growl as she took her position, weapon in hand. "Let's see how they like the taste of desperation." The colonists were ready, or as ready as they'd ever be. Makeshift defenses were manned, weapons primed, and everyone wore that same grim expression of people who had nothing left to lose. "Steady," Jareth called, his voice cutting through the growing din. Steady, the first wave hit like a hammer, the Vixari crashing against their defenses with a fury that was almost beautiful in its savagery. Blasts of energy lit up the night, casting long shadows and adding an eerie glow to the chaos. Jareth was in the thick of it, firing into the swarm, each shot a small defiance against the inevitable. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but not outwitted, not yet. Leora was at his side, moving with a lethal grace that spoke of frustration given purpose. Her movements were fluid, calculated, as if she'd been born for this moment of madness. "Still think we should have picked a different planet," Jareth shouted over the roar of battle. "Definitely," Leora replied, her voice carrying the hint of a laugh. "This one's hospitality leaves much to be desired." The fight was brutal, a tangle of bodies and noise that seemed endless. But slowly, painfully, the assault began to falter. The Vixari, for all their might, hadn't counted on the stubborn resilience of a handful of humans clinging to life with all they had. Jareth felt a flicker of hope, dangerous and bright, as the tide began to shift. They were pushing back, gaining ground, and though it was bloody and hard-won, it was something. "Keep it up," Greer bellowed, his voice carrying an edge of disbelief. We can do this together, they fought, a ragtag band of survivors against the odds. The Vixari retreated, regrouping, the battlefield littered with the debris of their failure. As the last of the invaders pulled back, the colonists let out a cheer, a ragged, exhausted sound that was more relief than triumph. They'd held against everything, and for now that was enough. Jareth slumped against the barrier, every muscle screaming in protest. Leora joined him, her eyes bright with a mix of exhaustion and stubborn defiance. "Well," Jareth said, panting, "that was fun. Let's not do it again anytime soon," Leora replied, offering him a weary smile. They stayed there for a moment, catching their breath, the night settling around them like a blanket. The air was still, the silence a stark contrast to the chaos they'd just endured. "You think they'll try again?" Jareth asked, already knowing the answer. "Probably," Leora said, her voice soft. "But we've made it this far. We'll figure something out." "Reckon we will," Jareth agreed, because what else could they do? Together they watched the horizon, waiting for the dawn that would bring a new day and with it fresh challenges. But for now they had each other, and that was something. As the first light of the new day crept over the horizon, the colonists began to pick up the pieces, mending what they could, preparing for whatever came next. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now they were alive. And on Zinth, that was the best victory they could hope for. The morning after the Vixari attack was the kind of morning that seemed to take pleasure in reminding you that you were alive, whether you wanted to be or not. The sky over Zinth was a bleak tapestry of washed-out colors, like someone had taken a child's crayon set and smeared them all over a dirty canvas. It was a miracle, Jareth thought, that they'd managed to survive the night. "Morning," Leora grunted, appearing with a mug of something that might once have aspired to be coffee. Jareth took the mug and inhaled. It smelled like burnt rubber and regret. "Thanks. Just what I needed to start the day. Thought you'd like it," Leora said with a crooked grin. "Figured we all needed a little encouragement. Nothing says encouragement like potential poisoning." The camp was beginning to stir, colonists emerging from the makeshift shelters, looking like extras from a low-budget disaster flick. Greer was already barking orders, his voice somehow even less pleasant than usual, and Kian was doing his best to keep things from devolving into complete chaos. And then there was Elise. Young, wide-eyed Elise, who'd somehow slipped through the cracks in a way only the young could. She stood at the edge of the camp, clutching a strange device that looked like it had been cobbled together from spare bits and sheer optimism. "Hey, Elise," Jareth called, waving her over. "What's that you've got there?" She approached hesitantly, as if she wasn't quite sure if she was about to be praised or scolded. "Oh, this. It's something I made. Just tinkering, really. Looks like something that could explode at any minute," Leora observed, peering at the contraption with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Yeah, well," Elise said, shrugging with the kind of nonchalance only a teenager could muster. "I was trying to make a better radio. You know, because the comm array's been about as useful as a chocolate teapot." "Let's see it then," Jareth said, gesturing for her to hand it over. Elise hesitated, then passed the device to Jareth. "It's a bit unstable, but I think it can, like, amplify emotions or something." Leora raised an eyebrow. "Amplify emotions? What, like turning a bad mood into a full-blown rage fit?" "Sort of," Elise said, biting her lip. "But I think it can also do the opposite. You know, calm things down." Jareth studied the device, a jumble of wires and circuits that shouldn't work but somehow did. "And you think this could help against the Vixari?" "I think so," Elise said, her voice gaining a little confidence. "You know how they're always messing with our heads, making us feel all angry and stuff. Maybe we could do the same to them." Leora exchanged a glance with Jareth. "Well, it's not like we've got a lot of other options." Greer appeared, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the device. "What's this? More junk? We don't have time for this kind of nonsense." "It's not nonsense," Jareth said, his voice calm but firm. "Elise thinks it might disrupt the Vixari's telepathy." Greer snorted, folding his arms across his chest. "And what makes you think that'll work? We're out of better ideas, Leora pointed out. And unless you've got a miracle tucked away in your pocket, we might as well give it a shot. Greer eyed the device, then Ely's, with a look that said he still wasn't convinced but didn't have a better suggestion. Fine. But if it blows up, I'm not cleaning up the mess. With that ringing endorsement, Ely's brightened. I think I can get it working with the comm array. It might need a bit of tweaking, but then let's get to it, Jareth said, handing the device back. We might not have much time. As Ely set to work, Leora and Jareth kept watch, eyes on the horizon. There was a lull in the Vixari activity, but it was the kind of quiet that spoke of impending doom rather than respite. The calm before the storm, or in this case, the calm before the alien mind games. You know, Leora said as they watched Ely's work, I never figured we'd be putting our faith in something like this. Well, desperate times and all that, Jareth replied, rubbing a hand through his hair. Besides, maybe the Vixari aren't as immune to our nonsense as they think. You're starting to sound optimistic, Leora teased, her smile taking the edge off her words. Don't get used to it, Jareth said, smirking. It's not a habit I plan on keeping. By the time Ely's had finished making adjustments, the sun had clawed its way up into the sky, casting a harsh, unforgiving light over the camp. Tension hung in the air, thick enough to choke on. Okay, Ely said, her voice tremulous with a mix of fear and excitement. I think it's ready. The colonists gathered, eyes on Ely's as she hooked up the device to the comm array. The air was electric, thick with unspoken hopes and the knowledge that this was either a breakthrough or a complete waste of time. Here goes nothing, Ely said, flipping a switch with a sense of finality that belied her youth. The device hummed to life, an eerie glow radiating from its core. The comm array, previously as useful as a broken promise, suddenly pulsed with energy, the kind that crawled over the skin and whispered secrets to the soul. Something's happening, Leora breathed, eyes wide as the air seemed to vibrate around them. Jareth felt it too, a strange sensation like fingers brushing lightly against his mind. It was as if every emotion he'd ever felt was being plucked at, a symphony of chaos distilled into a single note. But beneath it all, there was a sense of calm, a soothing balm to the raw, ragged edges of fear. Let's hope this does something to the Vixari, Jareth said, voice low, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. And then, as if in answer to a question nobody had quite asked, a ripple spread through the air. It was a wave, but not of water, of emotion, raw and unfiltered, crashing down on them like a breaker on a distant shore. The colonists gasped, a collective intake of breath as the wave hit them. But instead of chaos, there was clarity, a sudden, shocking burst of understanding that left them breathless. The Vixari were out there, Jareth realized, closer than they'd thought. He could feel them, a presence like static at the back of his mind, and he knew in that moment that they felt him too. Son of a bitch, Leora breathed, shaking her head in disbelief. It's working. I think it's actually working. Jareth nodded, still trying to wrap his head around the sensation. It was unsettling, like being caught in a current and not knowing which way was up, but there was a power to it too, a potential he hadn't dared to hope for. Ely's, you might have just given us a fighting chance, Jareth said, the words heavy with gratitude. Ely's beamed, her earlier uncertainty forgotten. I just hope it lasts, Greer, ever the buzzkill, scowled. Well, don't go celebrating just yet. We've still got a planet's worth of problems to deal with. But now we've got a way to fight back, Leora countered, determination in her voice. And that's more than we had yesterday. The air was still charged, the device humming softly as it continued to broadcast its signal, reaching out like a beacon in the night. The colonists, for all their skepticism and scars, dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a shot. All right, Jareth said, drawing a breath. Let's figure out how to use this thing to turn the tables. As they huddled together, planning and plotting, the mood shifted. There was still fear, yes, and doubt too, but there was also hope, a fragile thread that wound through them all, binding them together in their shared resolve. They were battered, bruised, and tired, but they weren't broken. Not yet. And as long as they had breath in their bodies and fire in their hearts, they'd keep fighting. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the universe gave you a second chance. And when it did, you damn well took it. The camp was alive with a nervous energy that could power a small city or, at the very least, a very determined light bulb. Jareth glanced around, his gaze landing on the group huddled around the newly jury-rigged comm array like survivors worshipping at the altar of a particularly unreliable deity. "All right, folks," Jareth announced, clapping his hands together like a gym teacher about to unleash hell. "We've got a new game plan, and it's about as insane as trying to teach a cat to fetch, but it's what we've got." Leora shot him a look that could peel paint. "Great. So what's the plan, fearless leader? Throw coffee at them and hope they are allergic to caffeine?" "Not quite," Jareth replied, suppressing a grin. "We're going to use Elys's device to send a massive emotional wave through the Vixari telepathic network. Think of it like a psychic hangover." Greer, standing at the back with arms folded and a face like thunder, grunted. "And what makes you think this'll work, genius? You planning to drown them in teenage angst?" "Pretty much," Jareth said with a shrug. "Turns out the Vixari are susceptible to the same kind of existential dread that haunts us all." "Who knew?" There was a ripple of laughter among the colonists, a sound so out of place that it felt like a ghost sneaking in through an open window. Gallows humor, sure, but it beat the hell out of despair. "Elys," Jareth continued, turning to the young engineer who'd unwittingly become their best chance at surviving. "We need to amplify the device's output. Crank it up until it's humming like a drunken karaoke night." Elys nodded, her hands already moving over the tangle of wires and circuits with the precision of a bomb disposal expert who'd had one too many drinks. "I've got a few ideas. If we reroute power from the main generator, it should give us the juice we need. Just make sure it doesn't blow us sky high," Leora quipped. "I'm not keen on becoming space debris," noted Elys said, flashing a lopsided grin. "I'll try to keep the explosions to a minimum." As Elys worked her magic, Jareth and Leora turned their attention to the rest of the camp. The colonists were a ragtag bunch, held together by duct tape, stubbornness, and the kind of camaraderie that only came from shared misery. "Listen up," Leora called, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife through soft cheese. "When this thing kicks in, we need to be ready. The Vixari won't know what hit them, but we can't guarantee how they'll react. Could be they just pack up and leave, could be they come at us harder. What do we do if they don't take the hint?" A voice piped up from the crowd, nervous and a little too hopeful. "Then we do what humans do best," Jareth replied. "We wing it." There was a murmur of agreement, the sound of people who'd long since accepted that winging it was their only option in a universe that seemed hell-bent on crushing them underfoot. "All right, let's get ready," Jareth said, clapping his hands again for emphasis. "If this works, we'll have a fighting chance. If it doesn't, at least we'll go out with a bang," Leora finished for him, her grin more wolfish than comforting. As the colonists scattered to prepare, Jareth and Leora stayed close to Elys, watching as she painstakingly adjusted the device's settings. There was something almost hypnotic about it, the way she coaxed life from the inert mass of metal and wires. "You know, if this works, you're going to be a hero," Leora said, her voice light but serious. Elys shrugged, her eyes still on her work. "I don't care about being a hero. I just want to get off this rock and maybe sleep in a bed that doesn't feel like a sack of rocks." "Ambitious," Jareth noted dryly, "but fair." The sun had reached its zenith, a blistering reminder that Zinth was a place where hope went to die. But here they were, clinging to it like a lifeline, desperate for a way out of this mess. "Ready," Elys announced, stepping back from the device with a look that was equal parts pride and terror. "All we need now is to throw the switch." "All right," Jareth said, taking a deep breath. "Let's see what this baby can do." With a nod from Elys, Leora flipped the switch, and the camp held its collective breath. The device whirred to life, a low hum that quickly crescendoed into a high-pitched wail, the sound of desperation given form. The air shimmered, charged with something indefinable, and Jareth felt his skin prickle in response. It was as if the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if this harebrained scheme would bear fruit. The colonists watched, faces etched with anticipation and fear. For a moment, it felt like the universe had paused, holding its breath in a rare moment of suspense. Then, like the crack of a whip, the emotional wave surged outward, a tidal force that rippled through the air with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. It was a cacophony of emotions, a deluge of human experience distilled into a single, overwhelming moment. Jareth staggered slightly, feeling the wash of emotions like a punch to the gut. Anger, grief, hopelessness, all the things they'd been holding at bay came rushing to the surface, a maelstrom of humanity laid bare. But even as the wave crested, there was something else. A sense of calm, a quiet strength that cut through the noise like a beacon. It was hope, raw and fragile, but there nonetheless. And then it was over, the wave dissipating as quickly as it had come, leaving the camp in stunned silence. "Did it work?" someone asked, the words a whisper against the sudden quiet. Jareth glanced at Leora, who was already scanning the horizon with hawk-like intensity. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough with the strain of what they'd just done. "But if it did, we'll know soon enough." Minutes ticked by, each one an eternity stretched thin. The colonists waited, breathless and tense, as if the very air around them might shatter with the weight of their expectations. Then slowly it began. A ripple, faint at first, like the distant rumble of a storm on the horizon. It was the Vaiksari, their telepathic presence flickering like a candle caught in a gale. "They're feeling it," Leora said, her words a mix of awe and disbelief. "They're actually feeling it," Jareth nodded, scarcely daring to believe it himself. They'd done it somehow. They'd taken the Vaiksari's greatest strength and turned it against them, using the very essence of humanity as their weapon. "How long will it last?" Elise asked, her eyes wide with a mixture of triumph and fear. "Long enough, I hope," Jareth replied, clinging to the optimism that felt like a newly discovered limb. "Long enough to make a difference." Greer, ever the pragmatist, crossed his arms with a scowl. "Well, don't go celebrating just yet. We've still got a lot of cleanup to do." But there was no denying the change in the air, the way the tension had shifted, a palpable easing that was as much relief as it was disbelief. "All right," Leora said, taking charge with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Let's get moving. We need to capitalize on this while we can." The colonists sprang into action, a flurry of activity that was almost joyful in its determination. They had a shot, a real one, and they weren't about to let it slip through their fingers. As the camp bustled, Jareth pulled Elise aside, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You did good, kid." "Real good," Elise blushed, her earlier bravado tempered by a humility that belied her years. "I just hope it's enough." "It is," Jareth assured her, squeezing her shoulder with a warmth that felt almost foreign in this bleak landscape. "Today you gave us hope. And sometimes that's all it takes." They stood together for a moment, watching as the camp surged with renewed purpose. The Vaiksari might still come, might still crush them underfoot, but for now they had the upper hand. "Let's get to work," Jareth said, his voice a quiet promise. "We've got a planet to save." And with that they joined the others, driven by a determination that was fierce and unyielding. They might be battered and broken, but they were far from beaten. Because sometimes, just sometimes, humanity found a way to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. And when it did, God help anyone who stood in its way. The Vaiksari telepathic network was quieter than a librarian in a morgue, and if there was one thing Jareth knew about silence, it's that it never lasted. The camp was a whirlwind of activity, a chaotic ballet of desperation and hope hammered into some semblance of order. People moved with purpose, even if they were just pretending to know what they were doing. It was like watching a circus of drunken clowns trying to build a house of cards. Jareth leaned against the cold, battered remnants of what used to be a communication array. With a metal pipe sticking out of it, it now looked more like modern art than anything functional. "You know," he said, Turning to Leora, when we get back to Earth, we should consider going into the art scene. We've got the wreckage part down already. Leora snorted, wiping the grime from her face with a sleeve that probably wasn't any cleaner. Wouldn't last a day. We'd end up pissing off some rich benefactor and end up back here. Or worse, in a cubicle. Fair point, Jareth replied, grinning. I'd take this planet's homicidal weather over a desk job any day. From across the camp, Kian was trying and failing to maintain some semblance of order. If anything, his attempts to organize were as futile as herding cats with ADHD. All right, folks, listen up, he shouted, trying to sound more authoritative than the squeaky megaphone that had seen better days. We need to get these barricades up. Just because we've given the Vixari a psychic wedgie doesn't mean they won't come back for round two. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, but most people just nodded, their faces a mix of exhaustion and grim determination. Even in the face of possible annihilation, there was a stubbornness that held them together, or maybe it was just sheer denial. Either way, it worked. Elise was at the heart of it all, supervising the repair of her cobbled-together contraption. She had the air of someone who'd just discovered they could juggle chainsaws without cutting off a limb. Impressive, sure, but probably not something you'd want to keep doing. I'll need some of this wire here, she said, deftly directing a couple of colonists who looked like they'd just stumbled out of bed after a week-long bender, and keep the power steady. We don't want another power surge. Yeah, because last time was a real blast, one of them muttered, earning a weary laugh from his companion. Greer, ever the wet blanket, hovered nearby with his usual scowl. You know, he said, crossing his arms, I'm not convinced this is going to hold. The Vixari aren't exactly known for letting bygones be bygones. They're practically the universe's worst ex, Leora quipped, joining them. But right now, they're a little too busy nursing a psychic hangover to bother us. We just need to keep it that way. Elise didn't look up from her work, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd taken apart more toasters than she'd ever eaten toast. That's the plan. We've got to keep the emotional waves consistent, like feeding them a steady diet of existential crisis until they are too depressed to fight back. Greer raised an eyebrow. So basically turn them into teenagers, exactly, Leora said with a grin. Hormones are a hell of a drug. Jareth, never one to miss out on the fun, joined them. It's working, isn't it? We've got a breather. He gestured at the camp where colonists were actually starting to look like they had a future and not just a tragic backstory. For now, Greer conceded, though his tone suggested he hadn't bought a ticket on the optimism train just yet. Let's just hope they don't bounce back quicker than a rubber ball at a physics convention. Throughout the day, repairs continued, the colonists working with the kind of fervor usually reserved for last-minute exam prep or trying to fix a car when you've got no idea which end of the wrench to hold. The sense of urgency was palpable, everyone driven by the knowledge that their lives depended on not screwing up. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of misery and mud, Jareth called for a break. All right, everyone, take 5, he said, more as a suggestion than an order. The truth was, they all needed to recharge, physically, emotionally, possibly even spiritually if you believed in that sort of thing. He sank down beside Leora, stretching out with a groan. I'm starting to feel like an old man, he confessed, and not the wise kind. The kind that complains about kids on his lawn. Speak for yourself, Leora replied, rubbing her own aching muscles. My knees haven't worked right since I turned 30. But hey, at least we're not dead. Always a bright side, Jareth agreed, allowing himself a rare moment of respite. It was a luxury, really, this fleeting peace, a chance to reflect and breathe in the toxic air without immediately choking on it. They watched in silence as the camp began to settle, the colonists gathering in small groups, sharing what little food they had, their laughter a balm against the darkness. You ever think about how all this started? Leora asked eventually, her voice thoughtful. I mean, we came here looking for a new start, and what did we find? A planet that's about as inviting as a rabid dog, probably for the best, Jareth replied. If it had been easy, we'd be bored out of our minds by now. True, she acknowledged with a nod. There's something about fighting for survival that really sharpens the senses, or dulls them. Not quite sure which. They lapsed into silence again, the comfortable kind that came from years of shared experiences and mutual respect. Do you think we'll ever get back to Earth? Leora asked, her voice quiet enough to be lost in the wind if he hadn't been listening. Jareth considered the question, weighing the odds like a gambler with loaded dice. Maybe, maybe not. Earth's got its own problems, last I heard. But here we've got a chance to build something new. Something better, Leora chuckled, the sound more wry than amused. And here I thought I was the idealist. I'm not, Jareth said, smiling. I'm just stubborn enough to believe that we can make this work. Call it the power of human stupidity. That I can believe in, she replied, her own smile matching his. But hey, at least we make a good team. Jareth looked at her, seeing in her eyes the same determination and fire that had kept them both alive through countless scrapes. Yeah, he said softly, we do. The night was surprisingly clear, the stars shining with a cold brilliance that seemed almost out of place on a planet so hostile. In that moment, Jareth felt a strange sense of peace, a rare gift in a universe that thrived on chaos and destruction. Let's get some rest, he suggested, standing and offering her a hand up. We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow. Right, Leora agreed, taking his hand and letting him pull her to her feet. Can't save the world on an empty stomach and zero sleep. They made their way back to the center of camp, the makeshift settlement buzzing with a quiet energy that felt hopeful, despite everything. As Jareth settled in for the night, his thoughts drifted to the future, to the endless possibilities that lay before them. It was a dangerous path, fraught with uncertainty and peril, but it was theirs to walk. And as long as they had each other, maybe, just maybe, they'd find a way to carve out a life in this inhospitable place. Because if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was defying the odds. And no matter what the universe threw at them, they would fight, they would endure, and they would win.